Welcome, first of all. Thank you for joining us. We are not EastEnders. This is not Phil and Grant Mitchell. You have tuned in to the FAP unit webinar. So our next slide is the aims, what we planned for you. There's three aims, but what I've tried to do with each slide is on the left-hand side, just summarise it really, if you're not one of those people who likes to read lots of text. So the what and the why we will start with. The big thing there is we're going to make a powerful case that working together as a pair is a really good thing for the children if we get it right, and a really good way of developing ourselves and each other as professionals and practitioners. Most of the time, though, after that, we'll be spending looking at relationships and how we build them in the settings and context we work in, so essentially in schools. And we'll be leaning heavily on your experience. So we want to know a little bit about how you've done it, what success looks like for you, and you've already started telling us about that. Wells is going to focus towards the end of our time together today on models to use when you coach together. We will finish at 5 o'clock. Let's get cracking. So the what and the why. We'll start with the definition. There's lots out there. We've chosen one each. The top one is the one Wells chosen. The bottom one's the one I've chose after going away and reading a lot of the literature. But you'll see the key thing there is that this is about planning, presentation, and evaluation in the top one, and in the bottom one, preparing, planning, teaching, and evaluating the results. So it's really clear that when we talk about team teaching, we're not talking about turning up and just delivering. That might be described as co-delivery. What we're talking about here is the power of working together to consider your context and the children's needs, to plan something for them, whether that's a lesson or a series of lessons, deliver together, and then review and evaluate. In fact, that review and evaluate will carry on. There's a sort of mini cycle that goes on within that as well, the sort of within the lesson perhaps, which Chris will talk about a little bit later. There are potential benefits. The slide should be now back on the screen. So in the literature, these are the ones that come up. So Chris and I have spent a bit of time doing some reading. There's probably other things that you might want to add to this list. I want to focus on a couple of these. I think the key message, as always, is on the left-hand side. Team teaching can develop the pupil, certainly, but also the practitioner. So if we think about the pupil first, more involvement and feedback per child, I think this is critical. So how often in PE, especially if we're delivering on our own, do we really get a chance to work with individuals? Do we get a chance to observe somebody work in this class of 30 children where we might get 40 minutes, observe someone in particular, give them some feedback, give them some Q&A that's personal to them and their experience, understand where they're at, help them, send them back into the activity to see how they cope, and then follow that up with repeat interventions to really embed the learning. It's really difficult, isn't it? And if we have two people there, there's more chance of that happening. So I think that's first sort of bullet point there about involvement and feedback is absolutely critical. The other one I want to take us down to, we'll cover a lot of the others as we go, but is the very bottom one, morale and enthusiasm. I'm guessing that of those hundreds of teachers and TAs that are on the call today, that there are quite a few who maybe PE isn't their favourite subject. Maybe they get out into the playground and it isn't the best experience for them. It's something that they're happy when they finish. And actually what team teaching allows is for us to have someone there with us who we can talk to during the lesson, before it, get some support from. And I think it's really important that we see the benefits to our sort of psychological outlook of PE if we do it well with somebody else. That it might not be still the most enjoyable subject, but we have someone who can listen to our thoughts about it and encourage us and give us some of that enthusiasm from them. So that's just some of those benefits, and we'll go into those a little bit more detail as we go along. So to summarise that slide, which I think is a really important one, is that those are some of the things on the left that came up for me when I was sort of answering these questions for myself. Of course, these things take time, and often we might not have that. I think when we talk to coaches, certainly, it seems to be the biggest issue for them is that they can't find enough time to make relationships with the people in school that they work with. And it might be that for teachers in schools, it's about making time for PE. There's a lot coming in the chat about the importance of PE in different schools being different. But I think as teachers, we need to value the subject if we can and find time to talk about it outside of the lesson, rather than just turn up to the lesson and then try and find time within it. We've got to see if we can do that. I mean, what we offer as an FAPE unit. A particular relationship there is the sports coach and the classroom teacher. So this will happen. Brams has already sort of talked about the school sport premium and the use of it. And it's about, if you're using the school sport premium, it's a requirement that the coach works alongside the teacher. This needs to be seen as a two-way relationship. It's often quite a brief relationship, just lasting maybe 40 minutes or an hour a week for 6 weeks or 12 weeks. So the pressure's on to try and make this work. And what coaches tell us really is that it's hard to get time with the teacher to start that relationship. But if we can make it work and make time for it, then what the graphic shows is that perhaps the sports coach, who might not really have heard the term assessment for learning or those processes on their sports coaching qualification courses, could really learn from the school teacher or the TA who it's really bread and butter for them in numeracy and literacy, this idea of planning the learning and checking progress, etc. Likewise, the classroom teacher might, with the sports coaches, help develop their skills of challenge and support within games, because often what happens in PE in our experience is that all children do the same thing all the time, regardless. And actually, sports coaches are well equipped to offer really powerful suggestions for how you might differentiate within PE, no matter what the subject is within PE. So that kind of shows this, again, symbiotic. I'm going to use it again. Yeah, I quite like it. So symbiotic relationship between two practitioners that can help them develop. Noel Srifahan, I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Apologies if not. Something you commented on earlier is that finding the balance between developing each other but also providing a high quality experience for the children. And I think you're quite right, that is a real challenge. It's sometimes you might have to take the brakes off the high quality PE and lose a little bit of control in order to spend a bit of time together as a coach or a teacher or different practitioners to share skills and have chats on the sidelines of your games and your lessons about what you're seeing and what's going on. So I think there is a balance. So hopefully we can do both, but sometimes the long term is better use of your time than the short term. Think about developing yourself so you can develop future children.
I'm hoping the next bit might provide you a little bit of maybe a little bit of application of some of the things that we've discussed. So I can tell through the chat box that there's a lot of people who've engaged in team teaching or co-teaching that have had some experience of it. But then on the other side, there'll be some people who may be new to this concept. So I think it's very worthwhile looking at this spectrum for models for co-teaching, where it shifts from one end of the spectrum, where you start to see, maybe one teaches, one observe models, or one teaches, one drifts model, where somebody has a real sole responsibility for the planning, for the instruction, for the delivery. And on the other side, when you go right down to the team teaching end at the other side, where there's an equally shared responsibility, where it's a bit of a double act, there's some trust, real high levels of trust there, commitment to the process, planning is astute in terms of how you're going to operate together. And there's a bit of a role play, like Mark alluded to at the very start. I think it's very worthwhile for the audience that we've got in here today to think about how these models could fit the needs in front of you. So what needs and wants are in front of me from my pupils, and which model for co-teaching or team teaching would fit that? Which curriculum topics within the PE national curriculum, when we break it down into Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2, would really fit these models of co-teaching or team teaching? What context are you working in, and where would these models best fit? So when you think about one teacher, one assist models, sometimes people might argue this isn't the best use of people with multiple and diverse talent skill sets. But if, for example, you're wanting somebody to lead in PE and somebody to observe and drift, there could even be a bit of a developmental relationship going on between them two. And I also think it's really important on those types of models to make sure that the lead and the observer stroke drift person are in a position where they're really clear about what they want to do in those particular roles, and make sure that they're really well planned within a medium-term plan of 6 or 12 weeks in a half term or a term. Parallel teaching is excellent for activities where interaction and high levels of maybe sort of like time on task is evident. Joint instruction with the teachers is a very sort of like big key outcome of parallel teaching, and there needs to be a real high level of coordination between the practitioners. It's a model that I'm going to talk about in a minute and really highlight how parallel teaching has helped some practitioners within a primary school bring this to life in PE. Station teaching is really, really good for dividing up instructional content into segments where you can present that to different locations within the room and start to get some real good discussion and perspective sharing about that particular content and how you've broken it down, whether it's some people who need a bit of a higher challenge point in terms of some of the content you're sharing versus some who maybe need it down in some simplified, brilliant basics in terms of how you're putting that information across. Alternative teaching is very much around smaller groups. Really quite good at actually banding there. So you might have a child who may lead it, who's maybe striving in the social corner and might really want to start developing some of the pupils who need some work within that social area with the psychological maybe confidence and esteem. And that's really nice for them to start working in a bit of an alternate teaching way. And the teachers then and practitioners can then really support each other in terms of how that model is working. What happened is that they decided to go for a parallel teaching model. So we've already talked about the parallel teaching model being great for activities where interaction is ongoing, where there's a lot of joint instruction between the practitioners, and that there needs to be a high level of coordination between the practitioners. So in this case, they opted for a parallel teaching model to try and celebrate the strengths and qualities of the people that were in the lesson. So the example was here that they decided through the parallel teaching model that they wanted to lower the practitioner teacher pupil teacher ratio. The teacher, a TA who had put in their development and action plan that they wanted to spend some time on PE, was released to work with this PE coach and an array of different class teachers. So the class teachers were always different, but the TA stayed the same across because there was a bit of a development arm for that person to work in this setting. They planned and prepared the lessons jointly, and they decided to look at some practice activities that were physically demanding and challenging for the pupils, where the practitioners had to really look at some key observational skills. And they really had to think about some discussion within the activities for the pupils about were they doing the right activity for them. Some previous evidence would suggest that PE was always about superimposing the same lesson content for all pupils. But they'd found that that was actually wrong, because if you give the child the same task, if you give 30 children the same task, they're not all going to be able to do it. So the parallel teaching model of differentiation was a fantastic way to show pupils the same perspectives in terms of working towards the same learning intention or learning objective during the MTP. Here was the activity. Sometimes, as I just mentioned, we superimpose the same task on all children. But actually, what this team teaching model really noticed was that they needed to use a parallel model where children were given the opportunity to do movement-based tasks, ball in hand-based tasks, ball on floor-based tasks. But crucially, the reason why they were given choice is they were acknowledging the perspectives and feelings of the pupils. They were trying to buy them into the rationale of the lesson to look at these underloaded and overloading, attacking or defending-based invasion games. So what happened is that I want you to visualize here. There's 3 pitches out on the yard. There is a favoured game for the attackers where there's 2 of them against 1 defender. There's an equal-sided base game in the middle. And there's an underloaded game where there are less attackers and more defenders at the other side. And what I want you to visualize is this team teaching model, co-teaching model of parallel teaching coming to life, where a TA might be on one pitch, a teacher might be on another pitch, and the PE coach might be on the other pitch. And they're interacting with the pupils. They're looking at them to see if they're doing the right activities. They're working with individual instructions. They're challenging the pupils to make right decisions for their learning aligned to the learning objective. And this type of practice is really, really good for pupils to make some informed decisions about how they're going to navigate through the system in terms of finding the right activity that's right for them at that time, with the overall outcome of progressing through this, that maybe they're working on a favoured game, 2 attackers against 1 defender, but by the end of the MTP and MTP block, they've made significant progress over the 6 to 12 weeks, where they're starting to do some harder based, physically demanding challenges as a result of making sure that they started at the right point. What I want really to put across there is that, we've painted an example to you there, but I want you to think about what works for you in your context and why. And if that is team teaching and co-teaching between a teacher and a TA, or 2 teachers, and it's not or a TA and a PE coach, or a teacher and a PE coach, and it's in isolation, well, make that work for you. It doesn't always have to be the ultimate PE unit, PE leadership team, a senior leadership team down and providing a big culture. What I want you to really think about is what works for you in your scenario and why, and how can you come over barriers. We're painting you some pictures today, and it's about you trying to think about where you can find that solution. So we don't expect everybody to having that example of a waggle that we've shared, but it's about you trying to find what works for you in your context. And I think it's a really big personal development tool that you could speak to your senior managers about within those respective schools. The biggest sort of like signpost that we've got here is that we've put some top tips on there for you, but you've ultimately got to trial and you've got to experiment with these things. And it's been really, really good to see some fantastic insights coming across the board. And all that leads us to say is a massive thank you. Stay safe, look after yourselves and your family, and we look forward to welcoming you to further FAP unit events in the future, whether that's next week or looking ahead. Thank you for now.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.